Hi, everybody. I'm Julia Mossbridge, co-founder of TILT, the Institute for Love and Time, and we're very excited in our TILT dialogues today to welcome Dr. Robert Lustig, whom we are calling Rob, and I am Julia. Rob, would you be willing to give just a background on you?
My name's Rob Lustig, and I know nothing about love and time. Uh, I'm not even sure I know anything about consciousness. I'm unconscious most of the time. I am a pediatric neuroendocrinologist, which means I'm a hypothalamus doctor. I study how the brain controls hormones and how hormones control the brain. I sort of got into this, through the obesity pandemic, and that led me to leptin, which led me to insulin, which led me to sugar, which led me to public health, which led me to addiction, which led me to the amygdala. And so I've learned a whole lot about other parts of the brain, but mostly in the posterior fossa, mostly in the emotional part of the brain. And so I'm really interested to hear, Julia, what you have to say about the other part of the brain.
One of the many other parts of the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my name's Julia Mossbridge. My background's in cognitive neuroscience with a focus on auditory visual synchrony and higher level functions that use multimodal information, multiple sensory systems information to, for instance, to perform reading comprehension or to determine that there's a target over there that you ought to be looking at or listening to or moving your head towards. I got really interested in time, and my postdoc was sort of secretly, but not so secretly, also about trying to figure out what the deal is with precognition, people who say that they dream or have visions of or experience future events that, according to current science, or at least the science I knew at the time, shouldn't be. And I started revisiting my UCSF roots. I got a master's in neuroscience from UC San Francisco. And I remembered Mary Dahlman, who was an
Mhm.
endocrinologist,
She,
neuroendocrinologist.
one of my mentors as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, I did my master's in her lab partly.
Fantastic.
And then that when Wolfram, my co-founder of Tilt, said that he knew this guy who was this amazing doctor who worked on nutrition, like real nutrition, what we actually need, not just food, but beyond that, what we need to put in our environment so that we can be healthy. I was like, where's this guy from? Oh, UCSF. Oh, I wonder if he knows Mary Dahlman. And that's how we started getting hooked up. But I think this conversation to me is about answering the question, where do we overlap? Because you brought up this one distinction, the anterior fossa. Let's tell people what that is, and the I'm sorry, the anterior fossa. Sorry, I'm biased, and the posterior fossa. Let's explain that, and then talk. Maybe that's where we overlap, but I'm not sure. Let's figure it out.
Well, I mean, the way I explain it to the lay public is the anterior fossa is the thinking part of the brain, and the posterior fossa is the feeling part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain. Um, Pretty much everything that happens in the posterior fossa occurs under the wire. That is not with conscious capability. It's, blood pressure regulation. It's, your sympathetic nervous system, your parasympathetic nervous system, telling the rest of the body what to do, and also receiving signals from the rest of the body as to, what's going on. All of these things occur mindlessly. And so, I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about what the brain thinks about. On the other hand, I clearly know that emotion ultimately impacts on that anterior fossa in big ways, as we are learning right now with the election and what have you, over the last 8 years, I would say. As human beings are turning into lizards, we are learning about, what the anterior fossa tells the posterior fossa, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, et cetera. So I'm particularly interested in those interactions, and sort of why our world has sort of caved in around us over the last 40, 50 years. What are the environmental triggers for that? What's the neural mechanisms for that? And how do you dig out of that?
Right. And so that's interesting the way you think about the brain as sort of unconscious and then conscious towards the front, because the thing that I find most fascinating about the anterior fossa, so that's up here. By the way, the fossa, it's defined based on the skull. So on the
Yeah.
base of the skull, you see this
Right.
big division, and it's very clear there's this chunk and that chunk, right? And that's why we're talking about these two chunks. The brain
Right.
itself is a little less organized than
Chunky.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But but in the anterior fossa and then the prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal cortex, you have all these unconscious processes that actually control how you think. They're dealing with how emotions are handled, so they're speaking a lot to all the areas that you're interested in. They're dealing with how information that comes in is funneled. Like, is this a threat or is this actually an opportunity? They're dealing with how much I'm going to raise or lower my capacity to receive intuition in this environment. Do I feel safe enough to receive intuition about what's going on that's accurate, or am I just gonna like panic? Right? That is a lot of, so it feels to me like these are very compatible systems that are working all the time together. And a lot of it's unconscious, even up front there. So when we think about thinking, we often think that thinking is conscious all the time. We know what we're thinking. Most of the time, you don't know what you're thinking. And at the last minute, it pops up above the wire and you go, oh, that's what I was thinking. Or, oh, that's a surprise. Or this thought just came into my head and
Right.
you don't know where it came from. It came from all of that conversation that your brain is having under the wire.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. But the way I like to describe it is, that the prefrontal cortex basically helps you predict the future.
Yeah.
Okay, it tells you everything that's going to happen before it happens. Now, some people don't have a prefrontal cortex, and so they, shall we say, live in the moment instead of preparing for the future. And I think that's where, we sort of get this. And the question is, what caused this prefrontal cortical dysfunction? Um, I am currently with my colleague Alyssa Epple, whom you know as well. We are going to be co-writing a book about the fear center of the brain called the amygdala. And turns out the amygdala has 4 brakes on it. So I'd like to, use an analogy. Okay, imagine you have a car, and the car of course, has 4 wheels, and each wheel has a brake. So you have 4 brakes. You sitting in the cab and you slam on the brake in the cabin, and the car stops, appropriately. What if one brake fails? Will the car stop? Sure, but with a big jolt. What if 2 brakes fail? Will the car stop? Depends which 2. If it's the 2 in the front, it'll come to a glide. If it's the 2 in the back, you might actually do a capsize. If it's either side, you might do a 360. But will you stop? Yeah, eventually you'll stop, maybe with damage. What if 3 brakes fail? Then you're going to fishtail. Okay, but will you stop? Yeah, you'll stop with a whole lot of damage. And finally, what if all 4 brakes fail at once? Then you are over the precipice and into the abyss, like the last scene of Thelma and Louise. All right. Well, that's where we find ourselves today, is in that, heading toward that abyss, with no brakes on the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. Those
Well,
4
wait,
brakes. Go ahead.
wait. How do you define those breaks? I'm super interested in the way you
Yeah,
parcel out those breaks. Yeah, yeah, because this is a
absolutely.
nice metaphor.
So the 4 brakes are the prefrontal cortex, reasoning, like, I can think my way out of this paper bag. The hippocampus, memory. I've seen this before. Interception, which is the afferent vagus nerve, which is conducting information from the gut and the liver, et cetera, up to the brain to say, I don't feel good. And there's a lot of, where this is more of
Well, from
nutritional and inflammatory information. And then the last break is oxytocin. Now,
Mm.
oxytocin, everyone thinks of is the love hormone. Of course, it is, but or the reproductive hormone or the milk ejection hormone. It is all that, but it is the safety hormone. It's the
Mhm.
hormone that actually can be in safety. And when you don't have that, all you do is see threat. And it turns out that the oxytocin receptor, the protein that binds that oxytocin, is the most methylated protein in the brain. And what do you think methylates it? Stress. So more stress, less safety, more threat, less ability to control your fear. And so that is what we have seen.
Let's explain that methylation changes the way a molecule is used
Yeah.
so that it's a way of regulating a molecule in the brain. You can methylate it at certain areas, it'll be used in one way, in other areas, it's used another way. So when Rob says it's the most methylated molecule, it's the most controlled and useful, in a way, molecule.
Well, control suggests you can uncontrol it. You can
Right,
reverse
not
it.
you.
And it turns out once you methylate it, it's pretty damn hard to unmethylate. So it's a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Interesting. Okay. So let's just quickly go over those breaks again. Oxytocin.
Yeah,
I just want to make sure we got them. Oxytocin, you just talked a lot about.
yeah,
Hippocampus, I've
yeah,
seen this before. Vagus, I've felt this before,
yeah.
right? And frontal lobes, prediction.
Right. Prediction of the future. Yeah. Those are the
Okay.
things that basically tamp down your amygdala. So your amygdala, your fear center, is in constant scanning mode
Mhm,
all the time,
mhm.
every single minute of every single day, just like the lizard. Because
Yeah.
where they don't know where the food's coming from, and they don't know where the predator's coming from, and neither do we. And the point is that in order to be able to, do anything in this world, we have to be able to put the lid on that. And those four systems are the lid. And the lid, unfortunately, because of our current environment, the lid's coming off.
Okay. Question. Or maybe thought. I don't know. Let's see. Um, you had said, because of what's going on in the current environment, it's like we're coming, like the lizards are waking up, or the lizard part of us is waking up, or we're becoming lizards. But I just want to point out that we've always had this in us.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is this is how our brains work. And so the question is really not who we're becoming, because that's always there. It's what do we need to allow the hypothalamus to function? What do we need to allow all of those breaks to be in good working order? And they're useful at times, and they're at other times they're dysfunctional. So what do we need to make it so there's this smooth function? And so my answer to that is we need more awareness of and practice in unconditional love, because that switches things like 180.
I won't disagree with you. Um, without question, love is the thing that bridges the anterior and the posterior fossa. Okay, you feel it emotionally, you feel it unconsciously, you also feel it consciously. Um, it's one of the few things that does. Everything else is sort of, uh, compartmentalized, if you will, that we do, one way or the other. Love is one of the few places where emotion seeps into cognition and action. So, I'm very clear on the need. Having said that, I still don't understand love. I mean, yes, I love, but I don't understand it. And the thing that I've learned through, shall we say 60 years of therapy is that the unconditional love has to start with yourself.
Yes.
And that
That is,
is the
that is what
biggest
I
problem.
that is what I understand. And what's interesting about the unconditional love starting with yourself is as soon as you have an experience of unconditional, like I'm not saying that once you have an experience of unconditional love for yourself forevermore, you will have that. That's not really what happens. But as soon as you have an experience of unconditional love for yourself, like, I just am bathing in the light of love, and there's just no, like, I completely accept and love who I am. what's amazing in the next split second, and I think it might actually be simultaneously, you also have that experience for everyone around you. Like because it's unconditional, there's no condition on where that love goes, right? And so if you're experiencing the love, all of a sudden there's no condition. Also, that other person over there, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, love is not transactional. If it's transactional, it's a business deal, it's not love. I mean,
Right.
that's what it comes down to. And unfortunately, it's kind of hard to attain that because of the nature of our society. And I'm afraid that over the last, 50 years, and particularly I would say over the last 15 years with social media, everything has become transactional
Let's
because
talk about that.
because because well, fear abounds. You don't know whether your next interaction is going to be comforting or a threat,
Right.
and just not knowing is the threat in and of itself. So it is a constant threat.
Well, it's interesting. Let's get deep on this because this may be a big intersection of ours. There's the addictive quality of social media, which is part of the plan.
I give talks on technology addiction. I'm an advisor to the Center for Humane Technology to try to get kids off screens. Yes, I totally get it.
So yeah, Tristan Harris talks about this all the time, and there's the Social Dilemma movie, which is fantastic.
Yep.
And so part of the threat, so the interesting thing about addictive things, and you talk about sugar in this context, and I've had the experience of going off sugar and realizing how much of a drug it is, and
Right.
staying off sugar and realizing how much better my life is. But the addictiveness of social media is such that, like any other drug, the one of the reasons it's addictive is it doesn't actually fulfill you.
Yeah.
So you
It
don't
never does.
actually get an experience of feeling loved, which is what people are up to. This is, but every once in a while you might have this, oh, people love that. Oh, look at all the likes. Ah, and that intermittent reinforcement, which isn't complete, you still don't feel this unconditional love. It's kind of a faker, but it's this like a sugar substitute. It's like this substitute that addicts you more. I mean,
Well,
do you have this sense?
well, in my book, Hacking of the American Mind, I basically I draw a very specific contradistinction between what you just described, which is, shall we say, pleasure,
Mhm.
and what I call contentment, happiness.
Yeah.
Okay. So contentment is sort of the baseline of happiness. I mean, there are other things that go into happiness too. I mean, aside from contentment, you can have rapture, like if you win the Olympics, that gets you both. Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive per se, but pleasure and happiness um, uh, are really two different things completely. So in the book, I describe them. I think there are 7 differences between pleasure and happiness. And the problem is that we as a society have confused and conflated them on purpose, because it gets you to buy stuff.
Mhm.
Okay. It's part of the economy. Right. I mean, 4 out of 10 of the top 10 commodities in the world are addictive substances.
Yep.
So it's not surprising. So differences between pleasure and happiness. Okay. Number 1, pleasure is short-lived, like a meal. Happiness is long-lived, like a lifetime. 2, pleasure is visceral. You feel it in your body. Happiness is ethereal. You feel it above the neck. 3, pleasure is taking, like from a casino. Happiness is giving, like to Habitats for Humanity. Number 4, pleasure is experienced alone. Happiness is usually experienced in social groups. Think about that one. Okay, it's a social thing. Number 5, pleasure can be achieved with substances. Happiness cannot be achieved with substances. Whoa, that's a big one. Number 6, the extremes of pleasure whether it be substances or behaviors. So substances like cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, or behaviors like shopping, gambling, social media, internet gaming, pornography. In the extreme, every one of those is addictive. There's an aholic after every one of those: shopaholic, sexaholic, alcoholic, chocoholic, etc. Okay, but there's no such thing as being addicted to too much happiness. And number seven, and the sine qua non of the entire argument, the whole reason for number one, for writing the book, and number two, for wasting all this time on this podcast, is pleasure is dopamine and happiness is serotonin.
Mm-hmm.
They are not the same. They are
Mm-hmm.
not the same. Different control mechanisms, different neurotransmitter entirely, different receptors, different regulatory pathways, different methods of clearance. So, like, the audience is, saying, like, why do we care? Like,
You do care.
neurotransmitters, who cares, right? I mean, it feels good. Both feel good. Yes,
Yeah.
pleasure and happiness both feel good, but they are not the same.
Yes, and reasons you do care. Well, first of all, I'd like to say when you talk about happiness, you're talking about something that scientifically we call eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia, right?
Right.
Contentment. Yeah,
Content.
the sitting like a frog on the side of the river. Yeah,
Yeah, like feeling satisfied, like nothing needs to change.
that's right.
Which, by the way, the first step towards experiencing unconditional love, the experience that nothing needs to change and you can still be loved.
That's
So, but the reason I want to sort of draw out this serotonin dopamine thing, and I don't think you're wasting time with it, is that we knew before we knew about this difference. Before we knew that serotonin was governing this kind of inner peace, this contentment, and dopamine was covering this sort of short-lived, yay, I smoked a cigarette or whatever it is. We knew it because in the language you can hear it. Like people talk about, oh, you know what? I love my new job. I sleep like a baby. It's so wonderful. Or, oh, that makes me feel just fall asleep and rise up contentedly. Like this, because serotonin is involved in sleep. And so people who have more of this experience of happiness, of contentment, of eudaimonia, they have better sleep. So one of the biggest problems we have is a sleep problem. In fact, there's this, I'm sure you've heard this, Netflix said that our biggest competition is sleep and we're winning,
Yep. Yep. Well,
that's a problem.
sleep deprivation is definitely a dopamine inducer,
Yeah.
without question. It's also a cortisol inducer. And of course, cortisol is the antagonist to both dopamine and serotonin.
But I'm going to like that
it's the
by what
killer.
you mean, it shuts it down.
Shuts it down. So, the way I explain it is, for the dopamine side, okay, there's this thing called liking, there's this thing called wanting, and there's this thing called needing. Okay, and this is, of course, work by Ken Barrage at University of Michigan, explaining these three different paradigms. Okay, everyone likes certain things, and there is no problem with liking something. Okay, there is really not even a problem with wanting something. Okay, it's basically what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's a motivation to exceed, and our society is based on wanting things, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. We are in a capitalist society. We're not suggesting everybody become monks. Okay, but the question is when you cross from wanting to needing, and that's where things get a little bit, shall we say, scarier. And the thing that does that, the thing that changes that wanting to needing, is cortisol.
Yes.
That's the thing that drives it.
Yeah, it tells you that it kind of tells you a lie often. Not always. You need cortisol to tell you when you're actually in a threatening situation, you're in a stressful situation, there's a lion in front of you, you have to deal with it. That's very helpful, reduces inflammation, gets you ready to go. But
in an acute sense. In an acute sense. I mean, and you worked with Mary Dahlman, you know more about cortisol than I do, probably.
Yeah, but it's supposed to go up and then it's supposed to go down.
Exactly.
The problem is when it's continually up, you're in this low dopamine, low serotonin. Now you're addicted because you want to get the thing that makes you feel good, but you're not going to be able to do it because you're constantly under stress. Your cortisol is up here.
Right.
And that causes just so much damage. I mean, talking to people who have worked in military and have military trauma, the cortisol is never going down, unless you manage that, right?
That's right.
Anyone who's sleep deprived or just addicted to Netflix and stays up to 3 in the morning so they can go to sleep because they're crashing and burning, everything's going to feel like a threat. And this is because it drives the cortisol. So yeah, you and I are simpatico on this. And so let's talk about how we can.
Well, before we go there, let's just talk about the other side. Let's talk about the serotonin side.
Yeah.
So everything that's happened to our society in the last 50 years, and I can sum it up in five things, uh, uh, it, it, sleep deprivation, ultra processed food, sugar, um, drugs, and
Social media.
social media. Well, not just social media. There's another one. Anyway, uh, what they've done is they've upped our dopamine,
Mhm.
and dopamine downregulates its own receptor. So you need more and more to get less and less. That's tolerance. And then when you throw cortisol on top, that actually increases the energy needs of the neuron, and the dopamine's basically going like crazy. So the cell needs more energy, and cortisol's inhibiting that. And so the neuron dies. That's addiction. So it's dopamine plus cortisol that leads to addiction. On the
No,
other
because
side,
the neurons firing like crazy trying to get up to the level.
right. And they can't. And cortisol basically then puts that cell at risk. On the other side, we have serotonin. So every one of those things actually lead to serotonin reduction. Metabolic syndrome, it leads to reductions in serotonin availabilities, serotonin crossing the blood-brain barrier, also tryptophan being converted to kyuranine in the liver so that there's less tryptophan being able to get to the brain to even make serotonin. All of this results in dysthymia, feeling lousy, and
Mhm.
then throw on top of that cortisol, which downregulates the serotonin 1A receptor. Now you have less serotonin, fewer receptors, and now you have clinical depression. So it
Yeah,
turns out addiction and depression are actually two sides of the same coin,
yeah.
but mediated by the structural changes in our environment over the last 50 years, and particularly over the last 15 years, as social media has become, shall we say, this overwhelming, predominant presence in everyone's lives, but especially our kids. And that is why they have suffered, quadruple the obesity and quadrupled the depression compared to adults who have just demonstrated double the obesity and double the depression.
Okay. So this is depressing, but it's true and important to talk about. But let's talk a little bit about how we both envision different ways to help the situation. And I think we both agree on the problem. And then we have different ways of helping, and I think they're equally important. So I would love you to sort of outline your like, how do we fix this? Especially if you want to, what's coming up in the book with Alyssa Apple. Sort of how do we fix this? And then I'll do a little how do we fix this thing too, and then maybe we go to questions. Does that sound good?
Sure, sure, absolutely. So, unfortunately, we a lot of these things are structural. They're now, sort of baked in to the cake, and it's really hard to undo them. And it's not like we'll ever be rolling social media back. you know I mean, it's here. That's progress. So we have to figure out ways to mitigate the damage. And we have to do that at two levels. We have to mitigate the damage at the personal level, and we have to mitigate the damage at the societal level. And the societal level is pretty damn hard because we have Congress that won't even like regulate social media companies. Section 230 still exists. Until we get somebody in Congress to understand the importance of actually helping fix the problem, and learning how to curate, for instance, something that's seems uncuratable. We're not going to fix it at a societal level. But what can individuals do for themselves? That's kind of where I think you want to go. In my book, Hacking, I talk about the 4 C's. Okay, the 4 C's, four separate things that all contribute to tamping down dopamine, upping serotonin, and reducing cortisol. Those are the 3 building blocks that we have to deal with in order to get there. Get the dopamine down, get the cortisol down, get the serotonin up. All right, how do you do that? Okay, the good news is the 4 C's, they're all free. They're all available to every single person on the planet. And they have worked over all the millennia. They just don't work now, right? So what are they? Number 1, connect. Now, that does not mean through Facebook. That does not mean like we are doing right now. I am getting no connection out of this phone, out of this Zoom call, okay? Because I am not in your presence. I'm not in your immediate presence. Okay, I actually have to look in your eyes. Okay, I cannot look at the image of your eyes in order to do this. We have a set of neurons in the back of our head called mirror neurons that actually take the information that your audience is projecting to you and transducing that into your own emotion. You generate emotion based on your friends. Okay, that is how you up your serotonin. Okay, and it has to be in person. It's why religion works, because of the
Well,
meeting.
we can talk about that, but yeah.
Well, it's the meeting place. Every religion on the planet, 4,200 religions, every one of them has one thing in common: a meeting place.
Question.
Okay. Now, the dopamine part, when the imam or the rabbi or the, priest starts speaking, that's another story. But they all have that. So, connect. Number 2, contribute. And that does not mean to your 401k. Okay. That means to someone else, contribute to someone else. Okay. Increasing the greater good. Okay. I mean, we have the Greater Good Center over at UC Berkeley for just this reason, is because we recognize that by giving, you get. And the only way to get is to give. Okay. There's taking, but that's not getting. Okay. You give, you get. And the point is what you get is serotonin. So contributions, and they can be in the form of time, they can be in the form of effort, they can even be in the form of money, philanthropy, but ultimately helping someone else, because we are social beings. Number 3, cope. And what is cope? Cope is sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. And that is where sleep comes in as being so important, because every single one of those, sleep, mindfulness, exercise, tamp down your cortisol. They are all cortisol reducers, every single one of those. And they all make you feel better. And it has been shown that if you do both mindfulness and exercise, you can actually reverse depression, clinical depression, because you get the cortisol down. All right. And finally, number 4, cook. And why cook? Because there are 3 things you have to do in order to be able to mitigate the metabolic/inflammatory onslaught onto your hypothalamus and your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala. And those are, you have to increase the tryptophan, which is not an ultra processed food. It's in real food, in particular, eggs, poultry, fish. You have to get the fructose down, the sugar down, because that's actually inhibiting mitochondrial function at a direct level. And finally, you need omega-3s to increase neurotransmission. And, ultra processed food is the antithesis of those 3 things. Real food is where you go. So basically, real food means you got to cook it yourself. And until we fix the food problem, we're really not going to fix the emotion problem. And that's what we've seen. And, that's one of the reasons why ultra processed food correlates with depression worldwide. And my colleagues at Sapien Labs in New York City and Washington, D.C. have basically shown 227,000 data points, okay, that ultra processed food consumption is a primary driver of depression, exclusive of race, exclusive of poverty status, exclusive of every other potential confounder. Ultra processed food is its own primary driving variable, and it's because of this problem. So, you can't self-love, you can't unconditionally love if you're depressed. Got to fix
Okay,
the depression first. Period.
all right, good. That's where we disagree. But
Okay.
before I sort of talk about the way I think that about this fix, repeat the 4 C's again for us, would you?
Okay. Sorry. Connect, contribute, cope, and cook.
Awesome. Thanks. Those are great. So I agree with everything you said except the last thing. And I'm in vehement agreement with everything you said, except for the last thing about how you have to fix, you can't get into unconditional love without fixing depression. So Abraham Maslow, the guy who created Maslow's hierarchy,
Yep.
coincidentally named after him, um, he, it's often thought that the very top level of that hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. So the ability, the capacity to develop into a full human who is actualized in the sense that your potential is out there and you're successful and things are going well for you. But the year before he died in 1969, he realized that there's some other need that he hadn't spoken about. And he called it self-transcendence. He wasn't the first person to talk about self-transcendence, but he was the first person to put it in his hierarchy of needs. And it was different from the other needs. So the way that hierarchy works is, you have to have your physical needs met before you can have your safety needs met. And you have to have your safety needs met before you have your connection or your social needs met. And you have your social needs met before you get to your work / self-actualization, etc. But the self-transcendence layer is at the top, but it's not necessary to go through all those things to get there. So it behaves differently. It's sort of like a puller upper. It reaches down from the top and can pull you up in any of those states. This is why you have the stories about, someone's homeless and dying on the street and they have this self-transcendence experience, right? Or there might be someone who is just unsafe. They're a refugee in a war-torn land, and they start having a self-transcendent experience of working together with other people to bring water to the other refugees, for instance. And unconditional love is a self-transcendent motivational state. So unconditional love is this sort of plays by different rules in terms of what it's capable of doing. And that's why I think, in fact, people who are depressed can and have had this experience that feels very out of the box for them of unconditional love. And that's how I got to this place where I think it's really important to study unconditional love and why I think it's actually a curative tool at any stage in your capacity, because it can do this trick. So when I was a kid, I was in a situation where there was lots of unconditional love, but also lots of abuse, neglect, problems, some dysfunction. And what got me through was the unconditional love was the thread that got me through. And it got me through by immersing myself through time. And so I know you have a point to make, and I'm just going to finish up this one point. That's why I started Tilt, is because with Wolfram, is because I saw how unconditional love can reach through time and grab you and bring you up and get you to a place where now you can deal with your depression, get you to a place where now you can deal with your diet. So that's my thought.
Okay. My question was, is that why they say when you smile, you feel better? Maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah. So that's a William James thing, is this idea that our brains actually can't tell the direction in time that things are happening. So that when you sweat or your heart goes fast, you think that there's some problem, but you might just be like, working out or having a hot flash, right? And so your brain doesn't know the direction in time. So when you smile, it's like, oh, there must have been something happy. Like it's actually not really tracking very carefully the direction in time.
I see.
So It is a hack. It's a great hack.
Okay, well, maybe that's why. So maybe there are ways, to sort of, self-actualize your way out of metabolic syndrome and depression, and then on the other side, addiction.
Yeah.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so, because these are, shall we say, really sticky problems that, the entire world right now is attempting to deal with and not doing a great job of it, unfortunately. But also, I haven't seen very much movement in terms of these, four C's,
Yeah.
for either, individuals or for society. And I think
Yeah.
it's because, we think we can buy our way out of it.
Well, we're still addicted, and so
Yeah,
we're gonna live live the addiction
yeah.
until we start to notice that everything's falling apart, which might be now. So in my hopeful frame of disaster land, we have to get as bad as we can get so we hit bottom. So
Have to
we
hit
really
rock bottom. Yeah, right. Well, we're getting close.
looks like we have some questions up here. Looks really good. Is there a simple way to explain the dopamine serotonin difference to a teenager with ADHD? How do we help them to care about it? Okay, you go first, Rob.
Oh, wow. All right. How do you, okay. Well, the way I explain it to my kids is um, that your prefrontal cortex is your Jiminy Cricket. Okay. It's the part of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. Okay. And when your prefrontal cortex doesn't work, you do stupid things. And, you know, is that what you want? Do you want to be doing stupid things? You know, that's a big deal for teenagers. They do stupid things, and they do stupid things for a whole bunch of reasons. One reason is because the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to myelinate. It doesn't finish myelinating till age 25. That's, very clear on neuroimaging. I can play the video of the, myelination of the prefrontal cortex for you if you want. I don't think you want. Um, and uh, while that's happening, those neurons are the most vulnerable. That's one of the reasons why marijuana doesn't seem to have a bad effect on adults, but it has an enormously problematic effect on adolescents when they start smoking marijuana. And the reason is because those neurons are the most vulnerable. So the goal is you got to keep your prefrontal cortex safe from the onslaughts of all of the things that can kill it. Well, one of the things that kills the prefrontal cortex, by the way, prefrontal cortex is the driver, the dysfunctional prefrontal cortex is the driver of ADHD. So those two go together. So you got to do everything you can to keep your prefrontal cortex intact and, from under fire, from under fire. And those four C's are exactly the treatment for that. The
And the enemy
medicine,
is, right? The
but
enemy is cortisol.
the enemy's cortisol. So the medicines are short-term effectors to try to help those neurons work a little better, but they only work as long as you give them. And of course, they have side effects. So
Yeah.
really, the medicines should be given because you need symptomatic relief, but you have to work at those four things anyway to, number one, limit the damage, further, and also to try to help reverse it.
Right. And I agree with all of that. And I would just say adding the idea of under a parent's guidance, trying out our app at Time Machine, which is designed to help people care about their future selves. So to develop a connection between the present self and the future self, a loving connection. So that's called Time Machine, and you can go to timemachine.love. And if you're under 18, you should use it with a parent's guidance. But it's really powerful to recognize that there's a questions that you can answer in your mind like when you go to bed at night, how late you go to bed, how sleepy do you want your future self to be? Like, is it kind towards your future self to stay up till 2 in the morning and watch Netflix? You
I
know,
keep I keep railing on my daughter, and all she does is stay up longer. It's it's a problem in my house on a nightly basis.
right. So get her hooked up with her future self.
And to be honest with you, it was a problem with my older daughter, and it's only now that she's 24 that she's actually, sort of, you know, finding herself. So
Yeah.
I'm living this prefrontal cortical dysfunctional paradigm, on a daily basis, even though it's not me. I did mine, 40 years ago.
Yeah. My son's 24, almost to the point of myelination. And so,
Good luck with that.
yeah, I know. I tell him like just make it to myelination. You're gonna be okay. There's another question here. Is there a physiological basis for seeking dopamine? Dopamine hits first thing in the morning. This is when I make impulse buys online. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I actually think that, I mean, from a purely physiologic standpoint, I would actually think that this is probably more likely later in the day when you've lost prefrontal cortical control. It's one of the reasons people, you know, uh, nighttime snack, especially after a full day of stress at work, they're basically, need something to alleviate the stress, acutely. And so that's when the buying occurs. So I'm not sure what the physiologic basis for seeking dopamine hits first thing in the morning is. I have to
I
say
think
that maybe
so.
maybe that's why I have coffee. I don't know.
I think I have an idea, which is
I don't know.
well, most people are or many people are in cortisolemia. In other words, they have too much cortisol all the time. It's not having these nice acute bumps. It does have a diurnal pattern. And in the morning is when you have the most cortisol. So you might, if this is a neuron that's firing with dopamine under the hand here, cortisol is like a blanket on it. In the morning, you're trying to get it to poke through. So that would be my explanation. It also suggests that you might have a problem with cortisol because in the morning it should peak, but it shouldn't peak so much that you have to force the dopamine up there.
Well, I mean, the diurnal rhythm of cortisol is inexorable. You can't fix it. Okay. It is part of, getting your body prepared for the rest of the day, and mobilizing uh, energy resources so that the brain can work when it wakes up. It is, it's not to be dismissed. You have to have a, a, uh, a morning rise in cortisol. What you don't want is for that cortisol to stay up the rest of the day. That's what you don't want.
Right.
And so that is very clear because that is the hallmark of depression
But if you
is
have cons-
constant elevation,
yeah, if you
and
have constant elevation, it's still going to do this peaking, but it's going to be way high now.
yeah, it's going to be way high and it's going to stay up and plateau. And my colleague Martin Picard at Columbia University, who is a mitochondriologist, I love that word, um, has basically demonstrated that what cortisol does is it increases energy needs, energy metabolism in every cell. And that's one of the things that ages you, that
Yeah,
hypermetabolism.
right.
And so
So
long,
everything's up.
the
Sorry, go ahead.
longer you have cortisol up, the quicker you die.
That's right. And in fact, one of Mary Dahlman's Wolfram is reminding me right now. One of Mary Dahlman's findings that I was in her lab to help with the rats anyway, is that if you have elevated cortisol over the long term, you produce a ton of glucose and that increases blood sugar levels. So to the person who's waking up and needing to have a dopamine hit, maybe check and see if you might be, pre-diabetic.
Maybe.
It's
Yeah,
worth
very possibly.
trying to change your diet to back down.
Absolutely. Changing diet is, it's the most malleable of those four. And you can do it, today, and start looking at what's in your pantry and what's in your refrigerator.
But
And
it's not so easy, Rob. I mean, so the thing is, like, listening to my son as he started going off sugar, and I remembered going off sugar myself. We have to acknowledge that it's an addiction, and it
mhm,
fights back. It fights back.
it sure does. Oh, I know. Listen, I did it myself.
Yeah.
And I didn't even realize how bad it was. I tell the story pretty frequently now. My drug of choice here. Um, I tell the story pretty frequently when I was at UCSF, doing clinical work, full day, patient care, et cetera. 4 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m. would roll around and the energy would just seep out of me, and I would find myself at Palio across the street in Millbury Union, and I'd have to get that big chocolate chip cookie.
Mhm.
And this became almost a daily ritual because I needed the pick me up in order to be able to finish off the day. And, I was gaining weight and I was, it wasn't doing a whole lot for me. And ultimately, it wasn't until I started actually researching sugar specifically when we actually did our isocaloric fructose restriction study at UCSF, where we took 43 kids and took them off sugar and saw what happened. We substituted starch so that the calories stayed the same and so that the weight stayed the same. What we saw was that every metabolic parameter got better by
Mhm.
doing that. Okay. But what we saw was that for the first 5 days of the sugar restriction, they were bouncing off walls. They were irritable as all hell. Okay.
Yeah.
And then in those, after the 5 days were over, okay, they settled down. They started being able to concentrate better. The teachers noticed that they were not as disruptive in class. The parents say, I got my kid back. It was really remarkable. And I said, wow, just by getting these kids off sugar, maybe I ought to get myself off sugar. So I stopped going for that chocolate chip cookie. And I got to tell you, for a week, I thought I was going to die.
Yeah.
And then the veil lifted,
Yeah.
and I haven't gone back. And
Yeah,
you
pleasant.
need you need that, that aha, you need that, eureka moment, and you have to be able to correlate it with the change in your behavior in order to be able to ultimately break it. That's kind of, necessary in order to be able to break your own addiction.
Right. And so the trick is being able to manage the unpleasant to get to the happy,
That's
right? It, don't get to contentment without managing some unpleasantness because you're hooked on pleasant. But the
well,
deal with life is there's things that are pleasant and there are things that are not pleasant.
right.
And the trick is to be able to ride those waves. And to ride those waves, you need that, what you're calling happy, what I'm calling that self-transcendent.
Unconditional love.
Yeah. Really,
Right.
really magic. I
I think the Dalai Lama called it joy.
Yeah, joy is another piece of it. In terms of the neural connections, you're in the way I think about it because I'm so focused on time, is that you're really putting energy and attention on the relationship between yourself and your future self, yourself and your past self. You're becoming more solid in time so that you're not just this flitting, the only thing that matters is in this moment, and I just have to do this next thing. You start to realize, like, I'm going to exist tomorrow. I existed yesterday. When I was a kid, I existed. There's this long thread of me through weaving through time. And I want that long thread to be beautiful. I want it to be strong. I want it to feel love. And so to me, that's the magic of what's happening. And it's interesting because we started this conversation about talking about anterior fossa and posterior fossa and what is the relationship and where we work. But in fact, we ended it kind of that way too. Where I'm saying like there's this thing that can reach back and like grab you and bring you into this sort of more mature sense of yourself over time. And you're saying, and you have to manage this sort of lizard stuff that comes up or you don't get there. And so both are true.
Yep, indeed, both are true. And they are related. I mean, ultimately, and we understand that, that anterior fossa, posterior fossa, the connections are, very strong. They're very real. On the other hand, they're very easy to damage. They're very fragile. And our environment in some ways has been set up to break it.
Yep, to reduce our self-regulation.
Yeah.
So we have to become kind of like, I think of it kind of like martial artists now. I mean, you have to be kind of a martial artist of the mind
Mhm.
to sort of say to yourself, "Oh, this isn't working for me. Okay, now I'm going to try this new thing. I'm going to work on the 4 C's." It's the mindfulness piece
Yeah.
is so key.
Well, yes. And of course, mindfulness means either focusing on nothing, which is really hard to do, or focusing on one thing, which is a lot easier to do. But as soon as you focus on two things, you're sunk. Okay, you are dead in the water because focusing, no one can actually focus on two things. This concept of multitasking, which, has sort of been brought to the fore as something you have to be able to do in order to be able to hold down a job today, is actually the biggest lie that we have told ourselves. There is no multitasking. Only 2.5% of the world can actually multitask. Everyone else is serially unitasking. Okay.
Oh,
And what we've learned is that every time you switch from one task to another, it takes 23 minutes to reorient so that you are actually on that one task. And every time you do it, you get a cortisol bump. And if the goal is keeping your cortisol down, that is like the worst thing you can do. And we've been told you have to do it in order to be able to hold down a job. To
all
me,
right.
this is the biggest lie of the 21st century.
Well, yes, and I think at higher levels, the levels that end up not being replaced by AI, there's awareness that if you don't focus, you don't do a good job. And so there's actually there ends up being a class distinction here that gets, unfortunately, sort of positive feedback loop, where people who are in the sort of educated class of the executive class who knows that they have to have time to focus, et cetera, and they know all this stuff, they're now consistently able to reinforce that and get more practice doing it. Whereas a group of people who are like, I have to scramble, et cetera, I've got 3 jobs and I'm doing all of them and I'm taking care of the kids, there's no way, right? There's no way they're going to get there. So there's this distinction. But I want to bring it back to what can you focus on to heal? And I'm going to say, and this is a phrase that my co-founder Wolfram Alderson has, which I'm going to say what you can focus on is radiating perpetual love. 4 years.
Radiating professional love.
Yeah, radiate perpetual love. It contains the time in there, perpetual love,
Mhm.
and it contains the awareness of radiation. So it just comes out, but it includes you because you're right there, but it includes everyone in your path.
Well, when you give, you get. So
Yeah.
if you are a radiator, you will be radiated upon. And ultimately, you have to radiate it from inside, and then you will receive it from outside. And then you have a positive feedback loop instead of a negative one.
All right. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you. This is our first dialogue process that we've had at Tilt, and this is a good one to model all the other ones out of. So thank you. I'd love to do this
Well,
again sometime.
so pleased, and thanks for having me, Julia. It's been an awakening and a pleasure, and I'm gonna go practice my unconditional love now.
Yay. I'm gonna cook myself a nice lunch.
Thanks.